Welcome Dr. Tim Lindsey to the stage.
My name's Tim Lindsey, and I'm here to talk to you today about headwinds. It's used by business leaders and government leaders and people in the media to describe obstacles to progress. It's basically a metaphor that reflects the inability of our economy and markets and policy and legislation, community development, everything that's good that we're trying to get done seems to be restricted by headwinds. And the term is used as a metaphor because it reflects the weather. You can't control the weather, right? And so the assumption is that you can't control the headwinds that are impeding progress. But I would argue that constraints contribute a great deal to headwinds. And headwinds are the result of a number of converging trends that are affecting our progress. For instance, on the chart behind me here, we see that we have expanding population and industrialization, which has led for some time now to increasing consumption of resources and degradation of resources. And with that, we're seeing decreasing availability of resources and decreasing resource quality. And as those two trends come closer and closer together, we're experiencing constraints. Constraints on the economy, constraints on the environment, constraints on our communities, and this leads to policy constraints because we don't know how to deal with all of it. And when you lump it all together, you get a great deal of uncertainty. And nothing impedes progress like uncertainty about the future. And so as the constraints all come together, we're experiencing a lot of problems, including social unrest. But these converging trends have been going on for some time, and they will continue. Global population was about 3 billion people in 1960. It's 7.4 billion today, and it's projected to be 9.7 billion by 2050. Also by 2050, they project that global food demand will increase by 70%, water demand will increase by 50%, electricity demand will increase by 70%, natural gas consumption will increase by about 50%. Meanwhile, availability of resources is declining. A fourth of the world's lands are now considered to be highly degraded by the United Nations. So these were lands that not that long ago were maybe forests, or croplands, or prairie, and now they're essentially desert. There's almost nothing growing on them. And our climate is changing rapidly. And when you mix all this together, you get a formidable mix of constraints that are impeding progress. And they negatively impact our economy, the environment, and the communities that we live in. So people sometimes ask me, what makes some innovations more sustainable than others? And I would argue that more sustainable innovations are innovations that address the root causes of being unsustainable, right? And these would include wastefulness. The more wasteful we are, the less sustainable we are. Deficiency. And this would include deficiencies associated with our processes that we use to make things and the products that we make. Dysfunction, which would include the interactions between all the components in our systems. And there are a good many of them, and I'll get into them in more detail in a minute. But dysfunctional interactions between components of systems tend to be deficient, which tend to be wasteful. And then finally, negligence. And this would be practices that are not ethical, are not compliant, are not responsible. And we've had a good many of those over the years that have caused a great deal of damage and have impeded our ability to operate more. Sustainability is an innovation in and of itself. It's an innovative way of doing business. Similar to Henry Ford's assembly line or electronic commerce. Sustainability is an innovation. And what makes it different from conventional business is that instead of just evaluating our performance based on quarterly financial results, we're also going to consider an enterprise's social performance and environmental performance, and we're going to do it for a longer period of time. Right? And companies that do that tend to outperform those that don't. And there are indices such as the Dow Jones Sustainability Index and a good many others that have evaluated companies' economic, social, and environmental performance over time, and they regularly outperform their peers that don't perform well in those areas. And so sustainability as a overarching business innovation is an innovation in and of itself. It's also a cluster of innovations, a cluster of things like alternative energy sources, alternative materials, alternative machines, devices, methods, software, all types of technologies. And so those have to be considered as well. And all of these things can improve our sustainability performance. So you might ask, what makes some innovations more sustainable than others, right? Well, I would argue that innovations are more sustainable when they have fewer impacts. Many of us are, if not most of us, are familiar with is ride sharing. The average automobile sits idle 96% of the time. So here's one of the typical household's most expensive assets, sits idle 96% of the time. Very wasteful. Parking in your average city occupies 24% of the area of the average city, and 30% of the miles driven by most people are used looking for a parking spot. So in response to this, companies like Uber and Lyft have recognized a system optimization opportunity. So through a simple app on a smartphone, it can connect a driver with a rider in ways that enable that driver to deploy one of their most expensive assets in ways that they make additional revenue, and it provides the rider a frequently more efficient way to get a ride somewhere. And Uber utilization is 30% higher than taxi drivers in terms of time that there's actually a passenger in the car. It's 50% higher in terms of miles driven. So think of the fuel that is not burned and the emissions that don't take place because of the more optimized system for connecting driver to rider. And this system has been so successful. I mean, Uber and Lyft are operating in dozens and dozens of cities all over the world now. And in the future, they'll be using these systems to deliver mail, to deliver all types of packages, groceries, fast food, you name it. So, so the first three principles preventing waste, improving quality, optimizing systems, are focused on doing less bad things, making a smaller footprint, right? Doing less damage, right? And that's important. But we already have a lot of damage that we need to do something about. Again, a fourth of the world's lands are now highly degraded and in need of restoration while our population is growing. And we need those lands restored, right? That's currently a $10 billion a year market in the US, restoring degraded lands. But the need is global, right? And one really nice example of how this has been done elsewhere is in the UK, Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park was built on a hazardous waste site. I mean, going back to World War II, that site, 618-acre site, was used to dispose of rubble from bombed out buildings. It has had all kinds of hazardous chemicals disposed of there. So when the UK was awarded the 2012 Olympic Games, they needed a site. They picked this 618-acre hazardous waste site for the location. So Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park now has 5 world-class sporting venues, has thousands of new homes in the development, has a world-class culture and university district, 110 acres of parks, and 15,000 permanent jobs for people in the area. And so they have successfully taken one of the least valued properties in London and turned it into some of the most valuable real estate in that region. But this notion of restoring value to degraded assets applies to more than just environmental assets. We also have to consider restoring value to social assets, to human assets. In the US, we currently have 1.6 million prisoners incarcerated, and it costs an average of almost $32,000 a year to keep someone in prison. And the incarceration rate in the US is 5 times higher than the rest of the developed world. And our system for rehabilitating prisoners is not particularly effective. Half of them are arrested within the first year after their release. 2/3 are arrested within 3 years, and 3/4 are arrested within 5 years. So a really dysfunctional system and lots of problems in terms of you got people who need value restored to their lives. So in response to this, the South Carolina Department of Corrections started partnering with industry to see if putting people to work in productive jobs could restore their dignity, restore their value, and make them productive members of society. And one company they worked with was Anderson Hardwood Floors. Back in the 1990s, hardwood floors became more and more popular. Their business was growing. They needed to add another shift to their plant. And they were having a hard time finding employees who could pass a drug test, employees that would show up to work on time and show up every day. And they heard about this program with the Department of Corrections, and they decided to give it a try. So they set up an operation at the prison, and they paid the prevailing wage. Right? They paid the prisoners the same wages that they would pay their other employees. Now some of this pay would go to the state to pay for their room and board. Some of it would go for reparations to crime victims, but they also sent money home to their families. Because, and this is really important, because 90% of the people who are incarcerated are men, and most of them are minorities. And by sending money home to their families on a regular basis, it kept them engaged, or keeps them engaged with their families. And so their families, when they're released, their families are glad to see them because they've been helping out with meeting the family expenses. This program has been very effective in terms of changing the behavior of these people that participate in it, because the recidivism rate, or the rate at which they are incarcerated again upon their release, is only 7% for people who participate in this program within the first year, compared to 50% for the prison community at large. And Anderson Flooring has hired a number of these people permanently upon their release because they've learned good habits and they've learned good skills and they put them to work when they're done. So the 4 guiding principles that I've covered today provide some very practical approaches with respect to how to improve the sustainability and performance of your operation and address the constraint headwinds that are impeding your progress. And I think that you probably recognize that for some of the organizations that are following these principles, headwinds are no longer a concern. They've taken the dynamics by using these principles such that the winds that were once impeding their progress are now a source of prosperous tailwinds that are contributing to their success. And so the intent here was to provide you some directional guidance. I encourage you to consider these principles in your own operations, in your own businesses. I hope that you found today's discussion helpful and that you will consider using some of the concepts and principles in your own applications. If you'd like to have further discussion on any of this and how it may apply to your own operations, I encourage you to contact me at the email address provided at the bottom of this screen. And we can continue the conversation because I love talking about this stuff.